Hi everyone, and welcome to week 7 of ENS 5520. This week, we continue working through the final wedge of the exploration phase of the Behaviour Works method. Up to this point, you've been building an understanding of your problem, your system, and reviewing quality evidence about your target audience. Now we move to the final and a critical step in the process of exploration, identifying and prioritising behaviours. In simple terms, this week is about answering a key question. What do we need our target audience to do differently to address the problem? This is a crucial transition point in the method. Before we can design any intervention, we need to be very clear about the specific behaviour that we're trying to influence. In complex problems, especially in sustainability, there is rarely just one behaviour that matters. There are often multiple behaviours that different audiences could do to meaningfully reduce or address our problem. For each of these different behaviours, there will also be multiple ways that we can intervene. If we try to target too many behaviours at once, we spread our efforts too thin. And more importantly, we lose the ability to deeply understand why each specific behaviour occurs. That's why prioritisation is essential. By selecting a single priority behaviour, we create the conditions for a clear behavioural diagnosis, targeted intervention design, and meaningful evaluation. The first step is to be clear about who we are working with. You've already started this through systems mapping and reviewing evidence. But now we need to refine that into a specific target audience. Different groups will experience the problem differently, have different drivers and barriers, and require different behavioural solutions. So, for example, if we're trying to increase active transport rates, we might consider groups like young adults, families, retirees, commuters. Each of these groups will require different behaviours and, as a result, different interventions. So, before we define our priority behaviour, we first need to ensure that we know who exactly we are trying to influence. You must definitely have a clearly defined target audience before you can proceed to step 2. Once we have a clear target audience, we move to the next question. What do we want our target audience to do differently? This is where we return to the idea that behaviour must be observable. Now, to clearly define behaviour, we use the ATACT framework. That is our actor, our action, our context, our target, and our time. This helps us move from sort of general ideas or goals about what we want people to do to very precise behavioural definitions. So again, for example, instead of saying something like people should use more active transport, we might define a behaviour as metropolitan office workers cycle to their office on a bicycle twice per week. That level of specificity is essential because even small changes in things like the context, the time, or the target can lead to very different behavioural barriers and enablers. At this stage, it's also critical to separate the behaviour from the intervention. The behaviour is what we want people to do. The intervention is how we help them to do it. So let's say, for example, we're tackling the problem of food waste. A behaviour that we might be interested in is households separate food waste into the compost bin at home. The intervention could be providing bin caddies and educational materials. Now, remember, interventions can sometimes involve behaviours, but the primary distinction is that the behaviour is ultimately what we want to see occur, and the intervention is the way that we make that behaviour happen. If we confuse these, it becomes really difficult to design effective solutions later. Once you've identified your audience and your behaviours, you'll end up with quite a long list. This is normal, it's actually encouraged, but we now face a pretty important question of which behaviour should we prioritise. We can't deeply analyse or intervene across 10 or 20 behaviours at once. We just don't have the resources to do a deep dive for that many behaviours. So we need a structured way to make decisions. Prioritization at this stage is essential because not all behaviours are equally valuable for us to target. Some behaviours might have a really large impact on the problem, but they may be really difficult to adopt. Others could be really easy to adopt but have very minimal impact on the problem. Some behaviours are already widely adopted, and that means there's little room for change in our audience. So, prioritization helps us identify behaviours that are both impactful and realistically achievable. One approach to prioritization is called the Nero model. This suggests that behaviours are more likely to be adopted when they're novel, so they're new or interesting, are easy, simple and low effort, response efficacious, so they're clearly linked to an outcome, and on-site or convenient, so easy to perform in context. This model is particularly useful when we're thinking about things like engagement, motivation, and behaviour uptake. A second and widely used approach by BWA in our projects is the impact likelihood matrix. This involves assessing each behaviour on two key criteria. The first is impact. How much does this behaviour contribute to solving the problem? If everyone in our audience performed this behaviour, how impactful would it be in reducing the problem? A good way to think of impact is to imagine having a magic wand that you can use to make everyone in your target audience perform the behaviour. If absolutely everyone did this, how impactful would it be in solving the problem? So let's say my problem is still food waste and my behaviour is for renters in metropolitan Melbourne to place all their food scraps in council-provided FOGO bins every week. If everyone in my target audience did this, how much impact would it have on the broader problem of food waste? The second criterion is likelihood of adoption. So here we're asking, how likely is my target audience to perform this behaviour? A nice way to think of this is to now imagine that your magic wand has been taken away. How many people in your audience would actually perform the behaviour? Would they do this? Coming back to my food waste example, how likely is it that metropolitan Melbourne renters will actually place all of their food scraps in the FOGO bin at all times? Each behaviour that you originally identified is scored on these two criteria of impact and likelihood out of 5. So each behaviour receives a score from 1 to 5 for impact, and then a score from 1 to 5 for likelihood. Higher impact and higher likelihood behaviours will get higher scores closer to 5, while lower impact or less likely behaviours will get lower scores closer to 1. Once we've scored each behaviour from 1 to 5, we can plot these scores onto a simple matrix. This now helps us to identify priority behaviours that are high impact and high likelihood, longer term opportunities that may be high impact but low likelihood, easy wins that have limited value on impact but are very likely, and low priority behaviours that are just low impact, low likelihood. We avoid those. This tool provides a visual and evidence-based way for us to make decisions. The purpose of this step is to identify a single priority behaviour to take forward to the deep dive phase of the method. We can also incorporate additional data into this process, such as things like current participation rates, feasibility, cost, or equity considerations. For example, we might think if a behaviour is already widely adopted, might not be the best use of our resources. We can incorporate things like scope for adoption by plotting our scored behaviours as circles, where larger circles indicate that there's more room for adoption. So in other words, less people are currently doing this behaviour, so there's more people in our audience whose behaviour we can change. So this week's process can be summarised as 1. Define your problem. 2. Finalise identifying your target audience. 3. Generate a list of behaviours clearly defined using ATACT. 4. Apply a prioritisation method. And then 5. Select your priority behaviour. This work directly feeds into assignment 3. In your assignment, you'll need to clearly define your target audience, identify a range of relevant behaviours, apply a prioritisation method, and justify your decision. This justification is important. In behavioural science, how we make decisions matters just as much as the decision itself. So ensure that you're able to justify both how you scored each of your behaviours and why you selected a single priority behaviour over all the other options. The key message from this week is effective behaviour change and intervention design starts with choosing the right behaviour to target. Next week, we'll build on this by moving into the deep dive phase, where we start to unpack the drivers and barriers behind your priority behaviour.